The mistake we made was, in fact, asking what the two hemispheres do, as though it was some kind of the brain was a machine. But if we'd thought of it instead as part of a person, we'd have asked the much more interesting and, as it turns out, the really important question: how? Mindfulness is likely to be a right hemisphere phenomenological entity. And I strongly believe it is, and the scientific evidence is there. But certainly in terms of its phenomenology, what one is doing is trying to help grow the influence of the right hemisphere and, for once, quieten down the much too insistent voice of the left hemisphere.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the FitMind Podcast, where we explore the science and practice of mental fitness. I'm your host, Josh, and today I'm joined by the amazing Dr. Iain McGilchrist, the author of The Master and His Emissary and his magnum opus, The Matter with Things. He's a psychiatrist, former Oxford Scholar of Literature, and one of the clearest voices on how our divided brain shapes everything from creativity to culture. In this conversation, we dive into why the left and right hemispheres attend to reality so differently, and why that matters for happiness, purpose, and meaning. How attention itself is a moral act, literally shaping the world we experience, and practical ways to shift out of the left brain overdrive and reclaim the spacious, connected awareness that fuels insight, compassion, and everyday joy. We also dive into what modern neuroscience, ancient wisdom, and even a good walk in nature can teach us about living a balanced and mentally fit life. Grab a tea, settle in, and let's dive into an eye-opening journey with Dr. Iain McGilchrist.
Iain McGilchrist, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Josh. I'm delighted to be here with you. And I'm also especially delighted to think that I'm talking to someone in Australia, because I just happen to be a great Australophile.
I'm glad to hear it. You'll definitely have to look me up when you do next come over. I have some good rainforest walks. A lot of people think of the left brain as logical and the right as the emotional, but you draw a deeper distinction, I guess, about how each hemisphere attends to the world. Could you start to walk us through that, and not really what they do, but how they experience reality differently?
Yes, that's right. I think anyone who thinks they know anything about the topic of the difference should forget everything they've heard, because what I'm going to say is quite different. And I was very much discouraged by my colleagues from exploring it because it'll become sort of very badly wrong pop science. So the mistake we made was, in fact, I think, of asking what the two hemispheres do, as though it was some kind of the brain was a machine. But the how question, in what way it did it, was the important question. I mean, we soon discovered that almost everything that the brain does goes on in both hemispheres. So what was the difference seemed to be, well, there isn't one. But that's because we were so fixed on the idea of it being a machine. But if we'd thought of it instead as part of a person, we'd have asked the much more interesting and, as it turns out, the really important question: how? Now, the how is not what I mean. I don't mean a mechanism by which, but I mean in what way. Such as, in what way do you say something? In what way do you carry out an action, and so forth? In what way do they produce a world for us? And in short, the difference is between two kinds of attention, which any living creature needs to be able to pay simultaneously. But unfortunately, they're mutually inhibitory, because one involves a very, very close, narrow focus of attention on a target that you want to get. And that's very important for survival of every creature. So every creature we've looked at has this capacity for half of its brain to be devoted to the question of, I need that, I want to get that, I want to manipulate that, I want to build that, I want to have that, whatever it is. But if you're only paying that kind of attention, you don't last very long, because at the same time you need to be keeping a lookout for predators, and for your kin, for your mate, for your offspring, which you have to be looking after while you're trying to get this. And so the other half of the brain, and in us this other half is the right hemisphere, shows a quite different kind of attention, which is broad, open, sustained, and vigilant. It's on the lookout without any preconceptions. So the left hemisphere has preconceptions. I want food. I want that worm. I want that rabbit. I want that seed, whatever it is. But the right hemisphere is saying, I don't know what there may be. There may be every kind of thing, but I'm on the lookout for it. And almost everything that the left hemisphere later decides to focus on is something that the right hemisphere saw first with its broader view. Now, why is that in any way important? Why should that matter to anybody? The reason is that each of these kinds of attentions produces a different phenomenological world. In other words, a different experiential reality. Now, you can imagine that if you're looking just at small details, your world is made up of this bit and that bit and the other. It has no overall coherence. It's made up of fragments. These fragments are isolated one from another. They have no continuity because you're moving from target to target. And they have no individual quality because you don't care which worm, which rabbit it is, you just want to guess it. Whereas the right hemisphere understands the difference between unique individual cases. The left hemisphere has already taken everything out of context. Now, that may not sound that important, but I realized when I started out, I had a sort of checkered career. I started out as a literary scholar at Oxford, and then went from there for philosophical reasons into medicine and so on, and have always been interested in philosophy and psychology. So, but when I was studying literature, I realized that taking things out of context completely changes them. And the context can make them something completely different. And that's to do with the way you attend. So that the way you attend gives you either this decontextualized, meaningless fragment that is atomistic and has no individual and unique quality. Whereas if you look with the other hemisphere, the right hemisphere, you see that all these things are interconnected, that they're actually part of an ultimately indivisible whole, that they are never actually fixed in the way that the left hemisphere sees them as a target to get it quickly. They're actually moving, flowing, changing. They are also unique, as I say. They're never just an example of something. They're what they are in their own right. And they're contextualized. And that means that you can see what is implicit. If you don't have a context, you can't understand what is implicit. And what is implicit, it sounds like second best to being explicit. Well, why can't you make it explicit? Well, the answer is because almost everything of value, once you make it explicit, becomes something else altogether. I mean, the most obvious example is a joke. If you explain a joke, it's no longer funny, right? And I discovered in studying poetry that if you write an account of what the poet's saying, it's something incredibly boring and mundane that you could have heard down the pub. But actually, when you read the poem, it's electrifying. It's completely different. It makes your hair stand on end. It is alive and it is affecting you, all of you, your body, your emotions, your thinking, and everything. So the body is an important context, and the left hemisphere is not good at interpreting, understanding, or getting messages from the body. So overall, you've got these two kinds of world, and one of them is animate. The right hemisphere's world is animate, but the left hemisphere's world is inanimate. And I mean this literally in that although it can understand that living things are living, it understands that cognitively, but it tends to think of them in terms of mechanism and material entities, whereas the right hemisphere is capable of seeing something that is quite clearly material as a living entity if it enters into our life. So the right hemisphere tends to see things like musical instruments as it collects them in its mind with things that are living because it sees that they have something of life about them. Animistic cultures in which not everything is said to have a spirit, but the things that we have lived with and have meaning for us have some sort of a spirit according to animistic traditions. So you've got these two kinds of world. One of them is practical. It means you can get stuff very quickly. That's its one great suit, if you like. And it's a very, very important one because without it, we would die. But the picture it gives of the world is false. It says there are just lots of bits, that they don't make any meaning, they don't cohere, they don't change, they're abstract in nature, they're not embodied, they're taken out of context, and they're not living. And what's more, they become a representation. So the right hemisphere is experiencing life. The left hemisphere is experiencing something like a diagram of life, very useful, like a map for getting around, but not at all like the world. I mean, if the map, when you opened it up, looked exactly like the world in front of you, it wouldn't be of any use. It needs to have very, very limited information in it. That's its strength. But when you think that the world is like what the left hemisphere tells you, then you're no longer living in the real world. You're living in a substitute, which is a representation. When you think about the word representation, it means being present again when it's no longer actually present. So it is a cheat. It is not the real thing. It is a substitute. It is distancing you from the vibrancy of lived experience, which the right hemisphere gets. So you've got these two ways of thinking. Now, it's quite true that we normally use them both all the time. We're alternating them in ways that are below consciousness, because if we were conscious that there were two ways of seeing everything, then we wouldn't be able to do the business of life. We'd be constantly stopping and sort of thinking, oh, should I use the other hemisphere? But of course, you can't do that. So in real life, that's what happens. But when we come to a society which is larger than a smallish community, you may have heard of Dunbar's number, which is this idea of a group that is small enough that he's an anthropologist, and he has this idea that when groups are small enough, up to about 130, or it might be 150, everyone can know everyone else in the group. And nobody can do anything without it being known to all the other members of the group. So there is a great bond of trust, because you know these people are known to you, you know how much to trust them, and if they are untrustworthy, they'll be ejected from the group. So this is very important. But in a very, very, very large society like the global, quote, village, you don't know who you're talking to, and you don't know these other people, and you don't know whether you can trust them. And so we talk about everything rather than sharing our experience. Everything is put into words, and that comes across in chat or in social media, or it has to be something that is expressed in a conversation. And the difficulty there is that you are being listened to by people, and they're making an assessment of how reliable you are from how consistent you are. So the worst thing you can do is contradict yourself. But in fact, experience is richly contradictory. So, in many religious traditions, there is the one and the many. Well, the left hemisphere is going, come on, make up your mind. Which is it? Is it one or is it many? And of course, it's very hard to explain to somebody who's got that kind of way of thinking that it is one and many at the same time. A thing and its opposite also need one another to exist. So when you see a road going up, it is also, as Heraclitus pointed out, the road that goes down. It depends on your position at the time and your relationship to that road, what it is. Nothing is hard and fast. And many things morph into their opposite. So there's a certain kind of sentimentality which can actually result in cruel outcomes. There is a kind of seeking of liberty. We all think liberty is a good thing, that is so excessive that it results in anarchy. And then there comes tyranny, the very thing that you were trying to get away from. So the world is complex and things are not always consistent. They very much depend on, if you ask me a question, I think the best answer would be, well, under what circumstances and when and for whom would that be true? And under what circumstances and when and for whom would it not be true? In fact, A.N. Whitehead, the philosopher A.N. Whitehead, who's one of the, well, for me, pretty much the most important English-speaking philosopher of the last 100 years, it said that the question in science is not, is this true or is it not, but under what circumstances is it true and under what circumstances is it not. Now, all this is a long way of saying that if you are in the kind of culture we're in now, you have to adopt one of these two ways of being. Otherwise, you'll always be contradicting yourself by bringing in a feature that belongs to the other worldview. And the one that has proved itself to be extremely good at making us powerful and rich is the left hemisphere. Now, the difficulty with that is it hasn't made us happier. And very importantly, it is less intelligent. Now, it is literally less intelligent. It's much less emotionally and socially intelligent. It doesn't really understand what other people mean by their utterances, their posture, their tone of voice, the things they don't say as much as what they do say. The right hemisphere understands that. The left hemisphere is just like, I don't understand what's going on. And it doesn't understand jokes, and it doesn't understand poetry. It doesn't understand music, really. It doesn't understand all the things that require to be taken in a non-verbal way, like the beauty of nature, like the beauty of a religious tradition, of a ritual, of a myth, of a metaphor, all these things. The left hemisphere doesn't really get, the right hemisphere does. And so if you follow the left hemisphere path, you find you've got an embarrassment of riches and power and so on, but no satisfaction, because all the things that give meaning to life have been left out of the equation. And so my thesis in The Master and His Emissary, a book I published in 2009, was first of all to show the differences in the way the hemispheres are, which is nothing at all like what people used to say. I mean, for example, the right hemisphere is not incapable of reason. It gives a great deal to reason, and in fact understands better than the left. The left is not rational. It is sometimes rational. It is sometimes completely irrationally emotional. And in fact, one of the most lateralized of all emotions is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. So none of all those things that people used to say are true. Anyway, in that book, I wanted in the first part to lay out what could be said truthfully, and then in the second part, to look at the history of the West from the ancient Greeks forward to postmodernism. Just a small task, but I take about 300 pages over it. And what I think I've shown is that 3 times in the history of the West, a civilization started almost from day one. It's a sudden moment. Civilizations don't just sort of seem to sort of edge along and get a bit wiser. They seem to come together, and then there's an amazing eruption of creativity, of fertility in all respects, in the sciences, in the arts, in drama, in poetry, in music, in astronomy, in algebra, whatever it happened, about 6,000 years before Christ. And then there's something similar happened again at the beginning of the Roman Empire, and something similar happened for us in the Renaissance. But in each case, if you follow it historically, within a few hundred years, it has moved from a very rich vision of the world, which is capable of accepting both the takes on the world of the right and the left hemisphere, to one in which only the left hemisphere seems to matter anymore. And so everything becomes stereotypical, hierarchical, power hungry, no longer shows individual nature, has nothing subtle about it. It's black and white, cut and dried way of thinking, largely cut off from intuition. And this progress results in the collapse of the civilization, the Greeks, the Romans, and now I believe ourselves, unless, who knows if it's too late or not, unless we can change track pretty radically. So there you've got perhaps rather a long outline of what's meant by the difference and why it should be important.
Well, that was beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. It's interesting that you highlight. So would the left hemisphere also correlate? You mentioned anger. Is it also correlating with unhappiness when it's out of balance, or is it just correlating with a sort of, well, first of all, does it actually correlate with unhappiness, or is it simply when it becomes too active that it may then lead to a sort of imbalance and unhappiness?
Well, happiness and unhappiness, of course, are very complicated things. And a very short answer to your question would be no, the left hemisphere is not associated with unhappiness. It's associated with denial. So it always thinks that everything is fine and it's going to get better because it knows everything. it's never wrong as far as it's concerned. It always has the answers, and that's partly because it is so very stupid. I mean, stupid people think they know everything. Clever people are aware of what it is they don't know and are much more cautious. So, no, if anything, it has a sort of fatuous optimism that it can sort everything out. Just give us a few more years and a few more, computers evolve a little bit further, and we'll get back to something that gives us happiness. But what gives us happiness is nothing to do with that. It's the things that the right hemisphere appreciates, which are community, closeness with nature, and closeness to the divine or the sacred. And those are things that in the last 100, 150, perhaps even 200 years have got less strength, if you like, in Western civilization. So gradually, communities have moved more, fragmented more, faith has declined, and the closeness to nature, simply the fact of living physically close to nature, is now a rarer thing for most people than it would have been, at the end of the last war. And certainly very, very much more than 100, 150 years ago, when most people lived somewhere where they were fairly close to nature. So, no, it's not like that. What it is that it is capable of great anxiety, the left hemisphere. And so, I'd make a sharp distinction between anxiety and depression, although, to be honest, there are many types of anxiety and many types of depression. So everything I'm saying is a bit too glib here. But for the purposes of trying to help what I think you're guessing at, it does have a lot of anxiety if it doesn't feel it's in control. So its whole raison d'etre is to be in control. So if it's not in control, what's happening? It gets very anxious and worried, and it has fantasies which are paranoid. So it believes that unless we can have total control, which of course is a fantasy, we can't have control of very much at all in life, including when we were born, who our parents were, where we were born, what our upbringing was like, what size we are, what intelligence we are. All these things we have no control over at all. And so we start from having very little control. And the secret in life is not to try and control everything to your, no doubt, rather minimal idea of how things would be if they were best, but instead to go with the hand of cards you've been dealt in the best way, to go with the flow, to coin a phrase. And that, of course, is in essence the basis of Taoism, which I imagine you and your community find as sympathetic and as imaginatively interesting as I do. So no, the answer is not that. And indeed, the right hemisphere on its own is prone to becoming rather melancholy. But melancholy and sadness they're not pathological. They are. If you didn't have sadness, you'd be a monster, frankly. The capacity to feel sadness is to do with feeling for other people as well as for yourself. It is, along the same lines as empathy, and children that have no experience of sadness don't feel sadness, are not empathic. So you get something like a sociopath who is congenitally incapable of feeling for anybody, and therefore actually needs to do all these violent things to get sensation of some kind, to get stimulation. So anyway, there we go. Let me know. Did that help at all, or was that completely off the wall?
No, it definitely does help. And I saw that you did the podcast with George Thompson the other day. I also spoke to him not too long ago, and I think anytime I read the Tao Te Ching, it seems to definitely allow me to move into I think what you would describe as more of a right brain state, I guess. Thank you so much for listening so far. I just wanted to take a quick moment to jump in and give you an update from the FitMind team. So we recently launched an incredible new course, which is free in the app, which is the preferred approach, and also on YouTube. It's called 30 Days of Meditation, Science and Bliss. And this has combined what we feel is the most effective contemplative practices with what we feel is the most important, the science. Honestly, I can't believe the course is free. It's genuinely incredible and has changed my life. Also, FitMind recently transitioned to an NGO. So if there is any way that you can help us at all, we now survive entirely off donations. And even if you can't afford to help out financially, if you could just give us a like or share this podcast or the course with anyone that it might help. Our goal here is simply just to help as many people as we can. We thank you so much. Now, back to the episode. You've mentioned that you call the right hemisphere the master. I was wondering why does that appear as the master? Because I would tend to actually imagine that the left thinks it's the master or feels like it's the master. But
that's the point, though, Josh. It thinks it's the master wrongly. Because as I keep saying, it knows so very much less that it thinks it knows it all. And in the story of the master in his hemisphere, it's just a fable, but that there is a wise spiritual master who looks after a community so well that it begins to grow and flourish. And he realizes he needs to deputize some things to a second in command who can do a lot of the ministering work that he doesn't actually have the time to do. He can't look after everything himself. And so he deputizes one of his brightest and best to go about on his behalf and be his emissary. And the emissary dons the cloak of the master and goes around saying, I'm the master. He thinks, he says to himself, well, the master doesn't really know anything. I'm the one that does all the work here, and I understand everything. And the trouble is that because he doesn't, the community declines and is ruined. So that is why. And in terms of neurology, why? Because, there's so many things. Starting with the ability to attend. So the right hemisphere has a much broader field of attention and is therefore seeing and taking in far more than the left. The left is just going, oh yeah, one of those other things, I'll lock onto that and get it. It's effectively the sort of money-making mentality, very stupid, but stuck. And so that's it. It has better perceptive qualities. I go through all this in the first part of the matter with things. It's better at perception. It's better at forming judgments. So the left hemisphere on its own, on the basis of what it attends to and perceives, comes to, frankly, delusional conclusions. The only reason we're not delusional all the time is that our right hemisphere is functioning and is much more in touch with reality and is saying, no, we don't need to listen to that. It's like this. And when people have damage to the right hemisphere and their left hemisphere is constructing the world, you get the most extraordinary delusional syndromes. I discuss about 25 of them in the beginning of the matter with things. And to people who've never come across them, I imagine they're absolutely fascinating. I mean, when I actually met people who seriously believed, in all honesty, the most incredible things, I was thinking, this is a completely remarkable thing that we need to know about us, that we all of us have this in us. If something goes wrong, that is providing us with a reality gauge. Added to which the right hemisphere is, as I say, more cognitively intelligent. IQ is more dependent on the right hemisphere than the left. That might surprise a lot of people, but it's also definitely more socially and emotionally intelligent, and it's also more creative. And that doesn't mean it goes off into a fantasy. What it means is it has the ability to see something in flexible ways until I see what it is. It can creatively recompose it to make it make sense of it. So all of these faculties are better in the right hemisphere than the left. And so a sensible principle would be to be guided by what the right hemisphere sees, not by the left. When the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere disagree on what the nature of something is, it is almost inevitably the right hemisphere that has got it right and the left has got it wrong. Now, you might say, well, how do you know? Because if you've got a third hemisphere to adjudicate between the two, and that's not necessary, because experience shows us this. Let me take an example. I have a whole chapter on logical paradox. And those are very interesting because they fascinate philosophers and they fascinate me. And a very famous and illustrative one is Achilles and the tortoise. Now, this was a paradox of Zeno of Elea, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher, so lived before the time of Plato. And he was puzzled by certain ideas. And he was one of the first thinkers who started to break things down, analyze them into parts quite so obsessively. I'm not saying there weren't other people in the world who analyze things. The ancient Egyptians did, the ancient Chinese have been doing it for a long time, but it didn't take over their entire way of seeing things. They were able to balance it. But at this point, the analytic mind sort of did a bid for control. And so he was thinking, Achilles and the tortoise. Here's a fable. Achilles, the famously swift of foot, he was famed for being an incredibly fast runner. The tortoise said to him one day, I'm going to have a race with you, and you're not going to be able to overtake me. In fact, you're never going to be able even to catch me up. And the tortoise explained it like this. Wherever I am, and he gave him, Achilles being a generous chap, gave the tortoise a very good head start. He said, before you get to where I start from, you've got to go there. And then when you get there, you'll find I've already moved on. So you now have to get to where I now am. But by the time you get there, I will also have moved on. And you can see this is an infinite series, and an infinite number of steps can't be taken in a finite time. What Achilles would have said if anybody had asked him is, nonsense, I'll overtake you in 3 strides. And we all know that that is correct. I mean, it is not correct that the tortoise will never be caught up with and never overtaken. So when you contrast the fallacious vision of the left hemisphere, that there are all these steps that must be taken, which is very hard to argue against analytically. When you put that next to the view of the situation as a whole, the right hemisphere view, you can see that the right hemisphere is on the money rather than the left. And you can go through many, many situations like this. And the left hemisphere is always, frankly, deluded at the worst and mistaken at best, whereas the right hemisphere is a much better guide. Now, this is very serious if our culture is in hoc to the left hemisphere, as I believe it is. All the arguments made for everything are effectively utilitarian, which misunderstands the nature of values like goodness, beauty, and truth. And all the reasoning is of an analytic kind. That, I like to make a distinction between 2 kinds of phenomenon, both of which could be called rational. One is the sheer mathematically following out of a logical series of propositions in the way that a computer can. And I'm going to call that rationality. And the other is reason, which is the product of a wise person's long experience of the world, in conjunction with being able to think logically. So it's not just pure logic, which often leads you to some very odd places. You need balancing that with an intuitive grasp of what life tells one, which one can never even verbalize very often, never mind argue about in a rationalistic way. And this applies to all the things that matter and give life meaning, which are things like beauty, the beauty of art, the beauty of people, the beauty of love, the beauty of sex, the beauty of nature, the beauty of music, all these things, the goodness of things, which is not just utility. Utility is a kind of goodness, it's useful to me, but there's other kinds of meaning to goodness, which are selflessness, and what happens when you're able to get rid of that domineering self and begin to experience a liberation, which shows you a whole other aspect of the world. And truth, again, is reduced by the left hemisphere to what it can verbalize and understand. But things that either are paradoxical in nature, and as Niels Bohr said, the great physicist said, the test of a great truth is that its opposite is also a great truth. And he made a distinction there, an important one, between great truths and little truths. Little truths like, did I have milk in my coffee this morning? Clearly the opposite is not true. But great truths, their opposite has some truth in it, and you have to remember the two of them. At the moment, we're very much of a mind like, it's got to be like this, it's got to be like that. There isn't a place for the person like me who says, well, it depends. We need both. And we don't need too much of this. And we need quite a bit of this, but again, not too much, and so forth.
It's such fascinating and important work. Yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing. You also talk about how attention is shaping the kind of world that is coming into being, and that's not just cognitive. I think you said it's a moral act, and that aligns a lot with a lot of the contemplative teachers. I think it's very much in the zeitgeist that your awareness is the kindest thing that you can give to someone. So yeah, is that aligning with what you were trying to say? I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that.
Absolutely, yes. First of all, to start sort of backwards almost, although at the most important end, your attention is a gift and is in that sense a moral act. So I don't think one could be a good psychiatrist. I don't think you can actually be a good doctor if you don't know how to fully attend to the patient. If you all the time appear to be following some sort of algorithm, and more interested in getting your questions answered than listening to what the patient has to say, you will not be a very efficient doctor or psychiatrist. And two people who I esteem from the early 20th century, both of them French, Louis Lavelle, who was a phenomenological philosopher, and Simone Weil, who was an amazing person, almost a saintly figure. They both said words to the effect of, attention is, your attention is the true gift of love. It is love that you are giving. So with that said, what I mean by things actually change when you see them a certain way, if you took a number of your people here to Skye and you showed them this landscape that's around my house, you could have, I hope, from them a sense that it is a beautiful and awe-inspiring place, that it would be terrible if you mined. But somebody who was only interested in extracting resources and making money would look at the mountain, which just happens to be a remarkable example of basaltic, columnar basaltic formation, would see this as just dollars. And so for that person, it would no longer be a beautiful thing at all. It would be a useful thing. And what's the problem? What we need more of this stone. Come on, we can all benefit and there'll be more jobs in the community, etc. And I know this is a big issue in Australia because of the phenomenal might of the Chinese in terms of their ability to buy land and exploit it. So there we go. So, I mean, I sometimes say about this mountain, it can mean many things. Its name, Talisker, in Norse means the sloping rock. And that means that the Norsemen who did come down here 1,000 years ago knew that it was an important landmark to avoid a shipwreck in the bay, which has a lot of hidden rocks in it. So that's what that mountain was for them. It was a landmark. For the Picts, who were already living here for thousands of years, it was a sacred place. It was the home of the gods. For 18th century watercolorists, it was a beautiful form to paint. For 19th century geologists, it was this columnar basalt. And to a physicist, it's 99.99% empty space. And the other 0.01%, well, we really don't quite know what it is. Which of those, the important question to ask here is, which is those is the real mountain? And I would say each of them is perfectly real. They're each of them true about the mountain. And they just take their turns depending on the attention you pay. So if you're desperate not to have a shipwreck, it's a landmark. If you are living there and you see it as the home of the gods, it's not just something pretty. If you've just come here on holiday to paint something, gosh, this is beautiful, and so on. So it depends. And a physicist is perfectly correct to describe it in that way. It's just not a very helpful way to help us through most of our daily lives. So all of these are correct. They're none of them untrue. But the difference is a moral one, because it makes a difference to how we treat it and how we relate to it, and whether we allow ourselves to relate to, in this case, natural beauty, and indeed to the scientific beauty. I mean, there are many species of animals and birds and flowers and so on. So I'm not saying that you just have to sort of bliss out in front of it. Hardly. I'm just suggesting that there are many ways of looking at things, and at the moment our way of looking at things is, I've given up listening to the news quite a long time ago, but when I did, I always heard everything being justified in terms of utility. So some absolutely devastating assault on nature was justified because we would get a lot of money, and for 20 years there would be jobs, and then thereafter that wonderful thing would never be there again, and the people wouldn't have their jobs, and so on. But this is the short-term and emotionally, ethically, and I believe intellectually barren way of thinking about things that rules out all that is of importance. And then we're surprised that particularly young people being introduced into this way of looking at the world are having deep anxiety, having panic attacks, having deep gloom and depression, thinking of killing themselves, because what on earth is the point in being there in this valueless, pointless world? So at the end of the matter with things, I spend 3 long chapters on what values are, what purpose is, and what is the sense of the sacred. And, if you want, we can talk about those, but I'm in your hands, wherever you'd like to go next.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that actually. And also, while we're on it, if somebody struggles with the sacred, what would you recommend for them? Is there like a placeholder for somebody that maybe leans more in that direction?
Well, I noticed that if you ask, at least in this godless country, if you ask people, do they believe in God, only about 10% of people say that they do. If you ask them, is there something beyond the purely material that is important, 95% of them say there is. And if you ask them what it was, they probably say it's the feeling of something spiritual, or it's the feeling of there's something sacred about certain places they may have experienced, or whatever it might be. So in writing that chapter, I didn't want to, as we say, frighten the horses. I didn't want people who might be able to be brought to a position where they could see this wasn't an entirely irrational way of thinking, to be frightened off by that word God. They go, oh, and oh God, he's a God botherer. He's a maniac. He's a we're not going to read any more of that. What a pity, because he wrote such an interesting book up to that point. So what instead is I try and build on ideas that I think most people can share, that there is a genuine question, which is not an answerable question, but acts as a placeholder. If you don't ask the question, then you forget that there's something there that's of interest. And one of the starting points is, what is the origin of all that exists? Now, I don't mean it's interesting to say, well, it all happened so many billion years ago when the universe exploded and so on. Because I'm not asking the question, what was before it? What was the cause of it temporally? I'm asking the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Which seems to me the most essential philosophical question ever asked. And people of the Anglo-American analytic tradition, who are very obsessed that only things that they can narrow down in language actually exist. So unfortunately, the most important existing things are exactly the things you can't narrow down in language. But they say, oh, well, it's just that it doesn't mean anything. But the trouble is that it does mean something. It's just that we can't answer what it is. And there is also, very importantly, a sense of something that most people experience and they may have experienced it once or twice in their life. They may, poor things, never have experienced it, but most people have experienced it quite often when they were in sometimes a wild and beautiful place, or sometimes on hearing a certain piece of music, or when a certain thing happened to them, and it had a sense of deep, deep meaning that was not construable in terms of the only terms we've got. Well, is it useful in what way? And why do you think it's any good? And so certain things are just have extraordinary value, and everyone who experiences it doesn't think it has a little bit of value. They think it has enormous value. So to ignore it is a great shame, and language is the really the obstructing thing. Having to put a word to it is exactly what blocks the path to it, which is why, as you know, the Tao Te Ching begins with the words, "The Tao that can be named is not the real Tao." Now that's exactly what I'm getting at. So I don't think I introduced the word God until about 30 pages into that chapter. And even then I say, but what a lot of baggage that word brings with it that is unhelpful. And we're much better to jump to very few conclusions or none and begin to think about what is going on in this space. Let's just use that word. You can use any word you like, the sacred, the divine. People somehow find the divine easier, even though literally it's just, saying the godlike. But, it doesn't matter on the word. The word is the least important thing. The thing is to have drawn attention to a space. And you see, the thing is that people say, but none of the things you say answer any questions. But there are some questions that are not open to that kind of an answer. But asking the question is the really important thing, which is why so many deeply spiritual texts are not asserting it's like this. They often are a little bit confusing to the literal-minded reader. They're going, how does that work? But actually helping you to edge out of that rather simple-minded way of thinking is very important. And don't forget that, again, to quote Niels Bohr, he said, we can really only understand physical reality using some such language as poetry. Now, what he didn't mean is that we should all write verses about subatomic particles. What he was saying is the language that we have, with its meanings derived from everyday life, is no longer suitable or purposable for the understanding of physical reality, and we need to talk in terms of metaphors, which is what poems tend to do. Now, to the very, in my view, rather simple-minded literalist, the reductionist, materialist, a metaphor is just a lie. And you hear people say this. I mean, people who really ought to know better. They say, when people say it's a metaphor, I just substitute the word lie. Well, go back to philosophical school, mate. There are other kinds of truths than those that can be literally stated. And they're very important ones. Can you literally state when you say, my wife means everything to me, and somebody goes, oh, everything? In what sense everything? And what does she mean, actually? I mean, you just can't go there. But it doesn't negate the expression as of a feeling that is real, very, very real. And more than a feeling, it is not just a kind of transient, amusing, pleasurable feeling. It is a deep sense of something that is built up over a long period and through much experience. So there we go.
Yeah, it's interesting. What comes to mind, actually, there was a study on Zen Buddhist monks, but they also took like Franciscan nuns and various other religious groups, and then they put them in fMRI scanners. And when they were meditating, or they were the nuns were singing or chanting, they couldn't actually tell the difference in the brain scan. There was seemingly no difference, actually, or very minimal difference. We're not at a point where we could tell a difference. And yeah, I think that points to something unifying in all of these approaches. There's a non-dual teacher. I like how you discussed the ground of being. I was actually listening to his audiobook, Locke Kelly. He's a psychologist from New York that trained with, I think his teacher was Delgo Kensei Rinpoche, and he does these what he calls glimpses throughout the book. So there'll be like mini 1 minute, 2 minute sort of meditations. And I was doing it as I was walking, and then he kind of points out something in your awareness. And then for me, the feeling of separation completely disappeared. But to my complete surprise, because I've never had that happen before, and I've done a fair bit of meditation. This was a slightly different style, but there was just complete feeling of interconnectedness with the world. It
Yes.
was
Yes.
it was almost difficult to think. And I was walking along the street, and as I saw a woman, as soon as I looked at her, this complete unconditional love came up. Like
Mm,
I realized I've never felt unconditional love before. It always
mm,
had
mm,
some form of
mm,
condition. And then
mm.
further to that, it stayed for 24 hours. I went to sleep, I woke up, it was probably slightly reduced, but I would say probably the most beautiful 24 hours of my life.
Mm, mm. And that would be a very good example of something that nobody could convincingly say to you, well, it wasn't anything. It wasn't real. Um, it was, even though words fail to give you, I mean, you've done a good job of hinting
No, it
towards
was
some
definitely
things.
ineffable. So I think you're right.
Ineffable, yes. And I mean, what I draw attention to is that we're so conditioned to think that the world is made up of things that, and that's one of the meanings of the title of The Matter with Things is there is a problem. Obviously, we're all saying there is a problem at the moment, but one of those problems is because we think of the world as made up of things, whereas if we saw with a different eye, with a different kind of attention, we would see that actually things are not ultimately divided and separate. They are connected. They need to be distinguished. But the difference between things being distinguishable and distinct and being separate or divided is incredibly important. And it's one that we don't often enough make. We think that if things are distinguished, then, as it were, they're somehow sundered. But no, we need to keep both the connection and the difference. And this is so fundamental to my philosophy that if there was one way in which I could sum it up, it is in the expression that I often quote these days. And excuse me if I repeat myself, but Goethe says, dividing the united, uniting the divided is the whole business of nature. And he goes on to liken it to the two beats of the heart, the systole and diastole, and to the in-breath and the out-breath. So he sees it as something that is embodied. And for me, it is not only a good way of thinking of nature, but of everything that I know in the cosmos, that things are constantly being distinguished and separated, if you like, but then they are still part of a bigger whole and they're brought together again in another whole. So it is this alternation of what we think of as parts, but are never really parts, with the whole. And we what I say about parts is that they're just wholes at another level. So a whole is made up of other wholes that in this context we call parts, but in another context we call them wholes because they also will, can be, if you like, can be further analyzed. But the important point is that these things are not fully distinct. And so what you saw on that occasion to me was you were granted an insight into how things are, which we are not normally granted because for practical reasons, it seems to make sense that we see ourselves as different, and there is reality to that. So it's not losing either that we are unique and we are individual, but we are also indivisibly part of one big whole. This is the, oh gosh, it's just language doesn't help, but I know exactly the truth of what it is that I'm saying.
Definitely, I agree. Language is our best tool, yet its bandwidth is extremely low.
Extremely low. Yes, yes, yes. But don't forget that it's largely grown up as a way of doing practical things. We started by, at least there is a very strong school of thought that we started by effectively singing, that singing is not a strange development out of language, but that language is a development of singing in which one makes more distinguishable sounds than one does by just intonation. And that's all in chapter 3 of the Master in Hemispheres. But that idea is that, language was developed so that we as a group could get together and work together to do a certain act. So you could talk about it and how you were going to divide the labor. In a world where we'd gone over Dunbar's number and we didn't just automatically, almost intuitively know how to do things together. So it starts from the practical everyday. So most of our words refer to physical objects, and our abstract words are invariably words that have concrete roots. They are metaphorized on the basis of something concrete. So even the word abstract, it comes from the Latin words meaning to drag something away from its context. So, that's why you can, language is useful, but you can't expect that we have words for things that aren't of everyday utility, and we don't.
Yes, that's so interesting. I think a lot of people are probably thinking at this point, okay, I'm definitely hemisphere dominant. What sort of things do you do, or what do you recommend for those people to, yeah, to start to move into more of a balanced state?
Well, this is hard for me to say, but I mean, the only thing that I absolutely know has helped such people, because they write to me, is reading perhaps even just the Master and his emissary. I mean, I have received countless messages from people saying, you somehow opened my eyes to something that I had never seen. And it makes perfect sense. But somehow I never knew what people meant when they talked about X and Y. But now I do. And I realize in retrospect that I've always been a very left hemisphere dominated person. But now I see things differently. What you don't want to do is to wait until you have a left hemisphere stroke. That's a rather drastic way of changing your outlook. So some things that will obviously help are, first of all, to stop denying the existence or importance of things that you find hard to verbalize. I mean, that's following on from what we've said. So there are things that you can only know what they are by experience, and you can't learn them or understand them by not, as it were, going into it with an open mind. So, I mean, the obvious example is swimming. It is no good sitting on the bank with a book and saying, I'm learning how to swim before I get in the water, because I don't want to get in the water until I know how to swim. But actually, you can only know how to swim once you're in the water. And so for many experiences that at the moment make no sense for you, the worst thing is to say, well, they don't make any sense to me, so I'm not even going to keep an open mind about them. And opening your mind to the possibility that there might be something there is a good way of experiencing whether for you it does or doesn't. I can't say it does. But I think it's an unusual person who knows no poem that has ever really moved them, knows no piece of music that they think is unbelievably rich, deep, important, that knows no beautiful place. Often it will be a church or a cathedral or a temple or whatever, but it might not be, or a particularly wonderful natural phenomenon that speaks to them, and think, well, this is not something easy to verbalize, but I need to open myself a bit more to it. So how about setting aside a bit of time to listen to some poems being read or to listen to some music that others have enjoyed. And I've been rather bad at doing the music, but on my website, I have put pieces of music. But the trouble is, there are so many pieces of music that I think are outstanding that it's almost overwhelming trying to choose. And I must make a point of going back and putting some more up. But what I did do during the first year of lockdown was read every day for 365 days another poem. And they were all poems that I thought were good. I wouldn't have bothered with them otherwise. And again, you can see them. They're up. You don't have to become a member of my website. In fact, I think they're in the very large open access area of my website. It's mainly open access anyway, and I think they're on YouTube, so you could listen to them. I mean, if you go to them with the attitude, well, I never got anything out of poetry, so I'm not going to get it, then don't waste your time. But if you're prepared to go along and say, well, I just want to see how, not stop inhibiting it and just see if something does happen. And, or going to a very good production of Shakespeare or something. I don't know. But the arts are one way. Another way is to practice meditation, as I'm sure you would agree. And my most commonly practiced meditation, and practically the only one that I do at all regularly, is, although I did have a meditation teacher at one stage, is simply mindfulness. And mindfulness is both simple and deep. So it sounds very simple. It's just stilling what in the Eastern tradition is called monkey mind, which is effectively the left posterior hemisphere, or even the left anterior hemisphere and posterior hemisphere together, talking. And so verbalizing and having an opinion and having a view and judging. If you can just stop all this unnecessary activity going on and just try and be present to it. I mean, of course, you know all of this, and I imagine all your listeners do. But what I'm really saying to anyone who's tuning in anew, this is not something that is complex in concept. It may take a little bit of practice to do it because we're so used to allowing our mind to say, oh, I don't like that, or will that not stop, or and I get that as well, and then you have to go, no, we're going to stop and start again. But what you're really doing is taking a step closer to a reality that you're not used to experiencing in that way, and seeing what comes to you. And if nothing, then nothing, but at least you tried. And I think for most people, they do see a different, they feel different, they feel more connected, they feel more peaceful. And, it's a very good thing. The only thing is that if you do it in order to feel peaceful or to be more effective, then you're still in the left hemisphere mindset. You need to do it just for its own sake, much as if you become religious because, oh, the religious people will go to heaven and the religious people will be favored in this world, and God will make them prosper. And no, if you go to God for what you can get, then you have not gone to God. And St. Francis said about prayer that when we pray, we should ask for nothing, absolutely nothing, because he thought that prayer was all thanksgiving and adoration. And he was an amazingly wise man. Normally prayer, which is really my favorite activity that connects me with something deeper, traditionally it's divided, or conventionally it's divided into adoration, confession, thanksgiving, and supplication, acts. And when I was young, I thought supplication was really the point of prayer. Can I not be this? Can I not have help with that? And so on. But now I think that adoration is the most important thing, because it changes entirely your your attitude to the world. It is no longer one that is in any way dependent on what happens to you and what comes out of it for you, but is a sense of something wondrous and awe-inspiring. And I think what we need to get back, many, many things, but if I had to reduce it to perhaps 3 things, I think it would be a sense of awe or wonder in life, and something that goes with it, which is a degree of humility, which is not the same as abasing yourself in some terrible way. It doesn't mean that you have to have poor self-esteem. In fact, not at all. It means that you realize that there's much beyond you, and that you don't know all the answers, and that other people may know things you don't, and that certainly there are things in this world that we do not. Why would our brains in 2025 have evolved to a point where they knew everything? That is, I mean, if you believe that, that's the most irrational thing you could possibly believe. Of course, we're making mistakes all the time with our rational thinking. We always have. And although I'm a great advocate of science and depend on science, both personally and professionally, and I think that one of the problems nowadays is that science isn't adequately respected, actually. But one of my problems with science is when people say, oh, the science says. No, if you keep your mind open, there will be different opinions about science. And that is when it gets really, really interesting, because some of those will prove more useful in the long run than others. And that's how science develops. If you don't hold that attitude, then science fossilizes, scleroses, whatever you like to say, but it's no longer helping us understand anything. So, yeah, there we are. Probably too long an answer, but please come back at me.
That was wonderful, and yeah, it's interesting. I agree. And any of the best scientists I tend to speak to, they're like, they would present it as this is our best educated guess currently. So
Absolutely.
you mentioned briefly actually the left hemisphere stroke, and I'm sure you're familiar with and probably know better than me the story of Jill Bolte Taylor. So how do the two how do the two hemispheres shape our sense of self? Like is it the left hemisphere is tied to like the fixed separate ego completely, or is there a spectrum? Is that shared? And is the right hemisphere, is that pointing to something like more relational, I guess? And
Very definitely, yes. In fact, one of the differences between the ways the hemispheres look at the world, if I wanted to make a big generalization, is that the left hemisphere is less interested in relation. The right hemisphere sees that relations are all important and is much more empathic, incidentally, and better able to understand how another person feels in relation to them than the left hemisphere. It's just a fact. Metaphysically, I believe that relations are actually what the cosmos is made of. It's not made of things that are then related. It is made of relations that then, from the web of relations, produce things that we attend to and go, oh, look, there's a crossing point in the web. There's something there. Let's call it a something. That's a thing. So I think it's the other way around. But the left hemisphere, I think, is more the home of the ego. And I'm using here a distinction that was made by Carl Jung, that he distinguished the self from the ego. Now, there was an issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies quite some years ago, in which people were asked, a few people were asked to contribute papers, and I was one of those people, and to engage in a dialogue with some spiritual leaders. And the point I wanted to make is that the idea of a self is by no means in itself bad. In fact, people who have no secure sense of self are very unhappy, very difficult to live with, and are often suffering from mental illnesses that are quite hard to treat. Now, there is no question that the Buddha had a sense of self. He knew that if he was hungry, it was he who needed to eat, not somebody else. That if he needed to sleep and did sleep, then it was he who slept, not somebody else. That if I came along and shot him, it was he that died, not somebody else. So we all have selves. And unless we have a sense of that self, part of the business of life is getting a more realistic understanding of oneself, a process that never really ends, then that is good. It is a self that is in relation very much to others, and it is from its relations to others that it gets its existence, and it is to the others with which it is related that it gives of itself by just being that self. Whereas the ego is over and against others. And the way that Jung understands the difference is that the child begins with a problem which is to do with understanding that it is separate. Because when an infant is born, initially, it feels that it is one with the mother. And we think that the child only in the first few months of life begins to understand that it is not actually the same as the mother, and that when the mother does certain things, and it may not be according to the wishes of the child, and so forth. But the point of good maternal care is to enable the infant to cross that barrier from being completely fused with the mother to being independent of the mother, but not abandoned by the mother. In other words, distinguished, but not separated. And her secure love and her attention are what enables that child to grow. Now, during infancy, there will be a balance of ego and self, but the ego will play a very big part. And what Jung thought, and I would agree with him, is that as we enter mature adulthood, the ego should fall into abeyance. It should no longer be important. And a good spiritual life is one in which the ego no longer has place. And it's that I understand. I mean, that's ideal. I mean, very few of us eventually achieve a state in which there is no ego at all. But what I'm really saying is that that's, I think, what people mean when they, in the spiritual tradition, say the loss of self, or deadness to the self, or dying to oneself, whatever. I think it's not, obviously, it cannot mean that there is no self in another sense. Interestingly, when you feel your pain, you feel it in your right hemisphere and in your left hemisphere. But when you feel another person's pain, you feel it in the right hemisphere alone. So the same bit of the right hemisphere is active when you are in pain and you see someone else in pain, and you feel for them, as you say. That's, of course, is a well-known phenomenon which became very topical about 15 years ago, may not be so topical now, of so-called mirror neurons, which activate both when you do something and when you see somebody else do it. People were very interested because they hadn't realized that when you see something or imagine something rather than actually do it, some of the same things are happening in your brain as when you do it, which is an interesting thought. But it goes, I mean, the reason why I think it's become less a topic is that we now realize that a lot of the brain works in this way, not just so-called special mirror neurons. And particularly the right hemisphere is what I would say, is that the right hemisphere is the one that makes those bridges, because it's just better adapted at moving outside of what it immediately experiences. After all, look, if your evolutionary origin is that what you do is you're quick and dirty, you don't ask difficult questions, you don't wait and go, well, it could be something else, you just go pounce. And now you've got it, because it's more effective than going, do I want it? Is it actually fair to it to grab it right now? Should I think you starve? So every creature needs a bit of, quite a bit of mental space, which is relatively unreflective, relatively unintelligent, relatively uncomplicated by moral imperatives, not particularly interested in values other than utility and power, and that is the left hemisphere. But God help us if we take that as our guide, if we take its values and its goals as our guide, then we won't last.
It's interesting, actually. I had a fairly difficult programming challenge today that I didn't think I could actually solve it. And I just dropped it with no intention of solving it. And I went for a walk. And then as I was walking, the solution came. Is that another way of activating? We hear a lot, just go for a walk. You have a problem, go for a walk.
Absolutely. And most of my writing was done by alternating quite serious walks with writing. And so I would often be mulling over something, and I get to a point where I think I need to think a bit more about that, and I take myself off for a walk for an hour or two. And interestingly, I'm probably just deluding myself, but there is a particular cliff walk that I like, where I walk with the drop on my left going out, and with the drop on my right coming back. And when I'm walking out, I feel no anxiety about it. I feel, as it were, that I'm happy with it, I'm in control with it. When I walk back the other way, I used to think, in a jokey sort of way, my left hemisphere is kind of weighing up. Can I just push him over the edge? Because I don't like what he's writing. I'm sure it's just a joke, really, but it is an observation. No, but going for a walk is a very long-standing way of facilitating fluidity of thought, because cognition is embodied. Cognition changes your body. What you think, and above all what you feel, has direct, immediate effects on the body, and the state of your body has an impact on what and how you can think and feel. So all of that is true. And one of the things one needs to get is a sense of fluency. And when one's sitting still, the fluency is parked, at least the physical fluency. And so getting into a fluid motion is actually very helpful. And some people I know just find that if they're able to go and swim for 20 minutes, actually that has the same effect. And you know that the school of philosophers founded by Aristotle was called the peripatetic school. Effectively meant the ones that walked around. And there is a saying, and I'm not sure who I can't remember anyway who originated it. Solvitur ambulando. It will be solved in the walking. At this stage in life, though, I'm rather fond of an old Chinese saying, which is, never stand up if you can sit down. Never sit down if you can. That's right. Never walk about if you can stand still. Never stand up if you can sit down. But lying down is best of all. My memory is not any good anymore.
I don't agree with that.
Perhaps
But
I need to go for a walk. What? You don't agree with that?
no, I mean,
no.
like your memory's getting bad. Or just not as
It's terrible. Yeah,
it's impeccable.
I'm afraid it happens when you get into your 70s. You just start forgetting particularly names. I'm afraid.
Younger than 70s. I am surprised. The walking.
Well, that's very nice of you, but I feel a good deal older than 70 a lot of the time. Anyway.
It is interesting, the walking. It's like clockwork for me. It comes at about, I think, generally somewhere between 20 minutes and half an hour. I feel the sort of the monkey mind, as you referenced earlier, start to sort of de-energize, and then all of a sudden good ideas flow, and I'll tend to be much more in the open awareness that you described.
I think that's lovely, and that chimes with my experience. But one of the things that I think is so important is that, let me repeat, that the left hemisphere jumps to conclusions. It is not the right hemisphere that is quick and dirty. It is the left, very definitely. Now, the problem is that when you're thinking through something deeply, you really do need to give it time to evolve. And one thing I can say all my life is that I have tried to give thoughts time to evolve without closing them down too quickly on something, that can be put easily into words, which is, of course, what the left hemisphere wants. It wants you to crystallize your thinking, publish a paper, and now move on. And I've been very happy and privileged in a way, in that I have been able all my life to avoid being on that particular treadmill, and so have allowed ideas that I could have closed down to something that wouldn't have helped at all, if I'd allowed things to go that way earlier on. But instead, I was able to not allow that talkative mind to say, I've got it. I've always said, but really, have you got it? And argue against it a bit. And I think what happens when you go for a walk, especially if it's a walk that involves not just walking along a road, but sort of walking in a landscape that you have to pay attention to a bit because of putting your feet in places and so on, that it distracts you enough from that mind where you're kind of, okay, I think I've got it. And then the other part of you that's deeper still is able to allow images, and it's often visual images that come that resolve the thing. Sometimes it might just be another meaning to a word or something like that. And that is really allowing the right hemisphere to come into it. And there's just so many examples of great scientists and great mathematicians who, no doubt, having done a lot of rather routine work, didn't resolve their problem or find their solution by just following logic, but by a kind of sudden insight when they were doing something completely other. So doing something completely other is very important.
Yeah, it's so interesting that it does come at that time. And actually, I think what you're saying really helps to crystallize why that is happening. And it is because the left hemisphere is just constantly trying to jump to conclusions and not allowing really the intelligence of the right hemisphere to like creative problem solve.
Yes, and it's much better at doing that. Do you know that wonderful saying of T.S. Eliot's, the meaning of a poem is the meat that the burglar tosses to the dog while it burgles the house. And I think that's so lovely because it expresses perfectly this idea of, the monkey mind going, oh, what is the meaning of this? And it's getting fixated on the meaning of the words. Well, that frees up, it's the dog is worrying its bone. And meanwhile, the poem burgles the house. In other words, it's speaking to your non-verbal mind. And that is so lovely. Not non-verbal, but more complexly verbal, because see, words can be seen as just tokens for things, which is how the left hemisphere sees them, and stringing them together into sentences is a matter of making causal chains that work according to syntactic rules. But there is another meaning to words, which is often hidden until a poem liberates them. So that is why when you take it out of the poem, you take the meaning out of the poem, it's just a nonsense, it's just a nothing, because those words have suddenly lost the resonances that came from the context of the other words. So every word is contextual, and the context changes the meaning.
It's really pointing to other ineffable, I guess, problems that you talk about, the hard problem of consciousness in the matter of things. And yeah, you challenged, I think, the idea that consciousness is just a product of matter. And I think you addressed it beautifully. And I'd love to, discuss a little bit about what led you to this way of thinking. And I don't know if you're familiar, if you've been following Anaka Harris. She's been doing the docuseries Lights On, which Yeah, she's come to a very similar conclusion. I wasn't sure if she spoke to you actually. I haven't finished the docu-series, but your thinking, I think, aligns quite well.
Yes. Well, I wonder what her husband thinks about that. But anyway,
He had her
but
on the podcast. Yeah,
yes, yes.
he's not
No,
openly discussing anything, but I do wonder.
no, I did read her earlier book. Name I can't remember. It was about
Conscious,
10 years ago.
a brief history of
Yes,
consciousness or
that's
something.
right. And I liked it. Liked what she said. Why do I think what I think about consciousness? Well, I mean, I start really from the point that there are only three possible relationships between matter and consciousness. Either consciousness is emitted by matter, or it is transmitted by matter, or it is permitted by matter. What do I mean by permitted? I mean that matter plays a bigger role in what is happening in the consciousness than if it just transmitted and already made whatever. So a radio set transmits, but I don't think the brain is a transmitter in that sense. I certainly don't think it's an emitter. And I have many reasons for thinking that, but the most cogent is that nobody, without any exception, and people have been trying for hundreds of years to work out how it is that consciousness comes out of matter if matter has no consciousness about it. A very important caveat. If there is, then of course it doesn't have to emerge from matter because it's already there, in which case the problem is solved. But if you posit that matter is totally separate from consciousness and has nothing of consciousness in it, there is no way that by some sort of a miracle, suddenly, oh, we've got consciousness. How did that happen? And just saying, oh, it comes out of complexity is a very unsuccessful gambit because, first of all, it doesn't explain why complexity should give rise to it. But also, as you probably know, there are 4 times as many neurons in the cerebellum, the ancient brain, which is much smaller than the cerebrum, the new brain, which we think of as our clever brain. The cerebellum has 4 times as many neurons in it as the cerebrum, but it doesn't sustain consciousness. And it's not that they're less well connected than they are in the cerebrum. Indeed, some of the most highly proliferative neurons are Purkinje neurons that only exist in the cerebellum. So none of that makes any sense to me. And also, there are human beings with no effective brain at all, no cortex at any rate. Just a midbrain, which is, sounds like more than it is. It's just the top of the brain stem. The spinal cord goes on, and the last 3 segments of it really effectively become the so-called midbrain. And well, strictly speaking, the upper one of the 3 is the midbrain, but they have nothing beyond the midbrain, and yet they are conscious. They're definitely conscious. They can see things, which is extraordinary because there's no visual cortex. They can listen to music. They can enjoy music. They can have favorite tunes. They can have favorite people. They respond to moods of the people. And yet they have none of the apparatus that we normally think is necessary to do any of these things. It makes you think. And then, of course, there are, and these are controversial, but there are, and I've never experienced anything like it, but there are accounts which I think it's unreasonably skeptical to dismiss them all, of people who have experienced consciousness outside the body. So there's a range of reasons for thinking that consciousness can't simply emanate from matter. If you can explain to me why I should believe that, then answers on a postcard, but only on a postcard because I haven't got time to read anything bigger. So that's the position I adopt. And so, what is the relationship between matter and consciousness? And to cut a very long story short, and that story is in chapter 25 on matter and consciousness in the matter with things, and begins on the topic of space and matter, the previous chapter 24. But anyway, in that chapter, to rather spoil the story and just cut to the chase, and therefore not to, as it were, explain my working, I think that consciousness and matter are different phases of the same primal entity. So I think that consciousness, it makes no sense to say that consciousness can be created from anything else. So I take the view that it is what philosophers call an ontological primitive. That simply means that it is, you can't get behind it. It is just a given. And I think that it's in all of the cosmos. And I think all of the cosmos is in the field of consciousness. And that's not an irrational way of thinking about it. In fact, it helps quite a lot. But obviously there's an apparent problem, which is that matter and consciousness seem quite different from one another. Matter is resistant. I can't put my hand through the table, but my thinking I can take wherever I like. Matter persists. I can put something down, I can go for a walk, I can come back, it's still there, I can go to bed in the morning, it's still there, but not with my consciousness. My consciousness depends on my thinking constantly. So I think what I would say, and again, apologies, but for no doubt repeating myself for some people, but I think it is an important analogy. The analogy is with water, which is itself a very important subject, philosophically speaking. I have a section on, not an entire chapter, but I do have quite a long section on the properties of water. And of course, water has been considered to be very important in almost every religion and every philosophical tradition. It is, of course, at the basis of Taoism, and it has figurative uses in many religions. So the thing about water is that it has, as chemists say, phases. In one of them, it's translucent. It flows, it moves around obstacles, and it moves on. And that's one thing. Then there's ice, which is opaque, solid, doesn't move unless given a whopping great push, and is mighty cold. And then there is the water that is suspended in the atmosphere in the room where you're sitting and the room where I'm sitting, and without which we wouldn't be able to live. Now, which of these is truly speaking water? I mean, in a folksy way, I can say, well, water is the stuff that flows and is translucent, because that's what in everyday parlance we mean by water. But it does have other conditions, and in some parts of the world, they are more important than the flowing kind. And they are those other two phenomenological manifestations of water. So I see what matter does for consciousness as giving a degree of fixity to consciousness's creations. So consciousness is creative, and the advent of matter, or the role of matter in this relationship, is to enable a degree of stability or permanence in the movement of consciousness. And that has good and bad aspects, as stability does. It means that it's not changing, and that's good, but that might be bad. So, but there it is, it has those qualities. And the other thing is that it provides a degree of resistance. And I can't explain terribly briefly why, but I consider resistance is essential to all creativity, that nothing comes into being without there being something that resists it, even if it's only in the sense that definition means the borders of something, and for something to have a definition, to be defined as a something, requires there to be things that it is also not, which is a kind of resistance. But also that many things are created by the carving away of something. And I sometimes talk about Michelangelo and sculpture, that he didn't put his David together, but just threw away stone. and that resistance to the block produced the result. But it's also true of the river that passes my house, that it only is a river because the earth offers resistance to the movement of the water. If it didn't, there would just be, water would just pool everywhere. And even the pools would, to be a pool, they require some resistance by matter. I have a section that goes into this a bit in The Master and His Emissary, how the boundaries of something are absolutely essential for its existence. And maybe that also is true of the soul or the spirit or whatever it is that we are dealing with when we're talking about this spiritual part of our nature, that it is something that can be distinguishable without being wholly divided from other things. Indeed, I believe it is very much interpenetrating with our material existence, which doesn't mean it necessarily depends on that material existence, but while we're alive, it is interpenetrated with it. And that is one of the ways in which we can, as Keats said, make our souls. I mean, extraordinary thing. He said, the world is a veil of soul making. He was 25 or something at the time he wrote those words, not older. And that is such a brilliant insight, that the soul is not just this mysterious, invisible object that is stuffed inside you by the Creator, but is actually something that is part of you, that is a very important part of whatever it is that we mean and are, and that our role in life is to grow it. And we have the choice. We can grow it or we can ignore it and stunt it.
I've seen that you've been in communication with and collaborating with Michael Levin. And I think, his work is extremely interesting and
Yes,
it seems to
very much so.
also, I think, point in the same direction. I wonder, could you briefly describe some of, I think you mentioned the head being chopped off of I think it was the planarian worms. I get confused with a couple of his experiments, but if you could briefly take us into how that crosses over with your work.
Yes, well, I certainly wouldn't dare speak for Mike Levin, and he is a fascinating thinker, and I believe we do see a lot of things similarly. I don't know how far he would go with me in terms of the more overtly spiritual side of things. I've no idea. But one conclusion seems to be, and I think what you're referring to is the fact that planarian worms and other creatures, as long as they're simple enough, can have their heads chopped off and they will regrow a head. Don't try this at home, by the way, at least not on yourself or any friends. And it will regrow a head. And the interesting thing is that the head will have the same memories that the original head had. And this can be done hundreds of times effectively. And the reason we know that is that, like many creatures, pretty much all creatures, these planarian worms can be trained to solve a maze, to find a way through a maze by trial and error, but they learn it. And then if you took an entirely naive, so to speak, planarian that had never tried this, it would take it many, many goes to solve it and take it time. But the one with the regrown head can solve it right away. And the same thing can be done with a slime mold. A slime mold is so primitive. Obviously, it hasn't got any neurons at all. You can hardly get more primitive. But a slime mold can solve a maze. And if you cut a bit off the slime mold and put it in, any part of it will have the memory of how to solve the maze. So that sets you thinking. And even more interesting is that we used to think that, well, many things. We used to think that a cell couldn't think. But it is now not controversial to say that a single cell can solve a problem that looks awfully like thinking, because it can take a step that will resolve a problem for which it has not been prepared by previous experience or by its genome. So this is a completely new problem crops up, and the cell can sometimes, in as little as 4 days, change something about its metabolism that will resolve the problem. Now, in case people think there's something fringe or odd, or this wouldn't be normally agreed by biologists, it was effectively this discovery in a different form by Barbara McClintock that led to her receiving a Nobel Prize in the 1980s. And the evidence is clear that we don't have to wait for billions of years for trial and error to change the genome, and no, that doesn't work. And eventually, oh, bingo, yeah, it doesn't work like that. So there is directionality, extraordinary directionality, so that a variant that would have taken untold years to come up can come up within as little as 4 days, is the example I know for certain, but it could be sooner than that. And another thing is, sorry, while we're on it, is that there is a gene which is an analog of PAX6. It's actually called ILES. And if you take this gene out of Drosophila, the fruit fly, not surprisingly, the offspring have no eyes. Fine. If you keep on breeding them together, the offspring still have no eyes. But after 14 generations, and fruit flies, 14 generations is not very long, the flies start to have eyes again, although they haven't got the gene. So what has happened is that a genetic something has happened in the history of the fly since this change to its genome that has enabled it to get beyond this block to development to what it knows it should be. I mean, I don't know what I mean by that. Nobody does. But in some sense, it's almost absurd not to use that word. Something about the organism is aware that it needs to go somewhere that is not where it's allowed to go now. And that would explain Simon Conway Morris's amazing assertion that the eye, which is after all an extraordinarily complex, I mean, there are different kinds of eyes, as you know, in different creatures, but that it is a very complex problem for evolution to bring together so many things to create an eye, and that this has happened 12 or 14 times separately over the history of evolution. So it may be that that goal is something that we are drawn towards, creatures are drawn towards, perhaps by the existence of light, I don't know. But anyway, there we go. And Levin himself has manipulated embryos, and now he's doing other things with neural tissue that evolves activities like a brain in a petri dish. He knows more about that than I do. But what he certainly has experience of is you can take a limb bud out of an amphibian embryo, and you can shake it up in a test tube and put the randomly organized cells back, and they create a new limb perfectly okay. And what's more, you can do that on the other side of the embryo. So the instruction should have been for a right limb, and you can do that on the left, and it will make a left limb. Now, what is interesting about that particular point is that it suggests that there is an overall form. I can't say it any more specifically than that. What a field of form is, we don't know. But some sort of form field is helping guide the evolution of that embryo, helping guide the line of descent of Drosophila, whatever it is. There's something that exists that is not just in the so-called code. And when we'd finished the amazing task of decoding, so to speak, the genome, we realized that there was never going to be anything like enough, by a factor of several million, enough information there to be the source of all the information needed for, say, a tadpole to evolve into a frog, a four-dimensional problem, or even a human embryo to evolve into a human. I mean, it's one of those things that happens every day, but we don't know exactly how these forms are perpetuated. There is, of course, the work of Rupert Sheldrake, who I hope will live to see himself vindicated. Not everything, perhaps, that he believed about morphogenetic fields will turn out to be right, but that's true of every scientist. But my goodness, what foresight he had 40 years ago to imagine that something of the kind is necessary in biology. But so I just want to pay tribute to him for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that and agree. Is that what Michael Levin is? Because he talks a lot about the bioenergetic field, and through manipulating that, they can also affect future effects. So less emphasis on DNA. Is that going to be the same or a version of, or something that might connect to a type of?
Well, as I say, I really can't and won't speak for Michael Levin.
Yeah, we'll have to chat to him at some point. Definitely. Oh, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you and him working together more in the future. I've got the second video you put up with you two together up to watch, but I haven't finished it yet. So
actually, it's called. I didn't call it that, but somebody I think at Michael's end called it 2. But in fact, it's about the 7th. We've done a whole lot. We did. We did at least 5, I think, earlier ones. Him and myself and an AI technologist, Richard. I think I'm awfully sorry. I don't mean any disrespect. I can't remember his name. And then I've done 2 with him on his own. So that was the second of those. And yes, I hope that he will be willing to talk, tolerate my attempts to understand what it is he's doing. So there we are.
I'm sure he will. I'm sure he will. We very much appreciate your work, and yeah, keep going. I look forward to seeing your future books or whatever else you're working on.
Well, may I mention that I'm not sure how many more books I will ever write, but for one reason or another, mainly by accident, I started Substack about a month ago. If anybody's interested and is watching this, please join my Substack, and that's not a mercenary request, because it's entirely free to everybody. Everything on my Substack is. If you're kind enough to contribute to me, I very much appreciate it, because it helps. But you won't get anything different than if you just go along as a free browser. So, because I think at this stage in life, getting the word out is more important to me than money, although unfortunately the world is so constructed that it comes in handy from time to time.
Indeed it does. And I'll link the Substack below. And if someone was looking to start with your books, would you still recommend that they go to The Master and His Emissary first, or straight to Matter with Things?
I don't know, really. I mean, the response to The Master and His Emissary has been very good. And it's shorter.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been absolutely incredible and a real pleasure. I think you're doing amazing work, and I look forward to seeing you.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, for having me along. And
thank you so much, Iain. Keep it up.
Thank
you.
Appreciate
it. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please, if you could give us a like, a subscribe, and hit the notification bell, that would really help us out. Or just share this episode with a friend, share the course with a friend. Anything would go such a long way. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.